Can you in general actually just zoom out and also talk about the Hopper architecture, the NVIDIA Hopper GPU architecture, and the difference between H100 and H800, like you mentioned, the interconnects?
Yeah, so there's, Ampere was the A100 and then H100 Hopper, right? People use them synonymously in the US because really there's just H100 and now there's H200, right? But same thing, mostly. In China, there have been different salvos of export restrictions. So initially, the U.S. government limited on a two-factor scale, right, which is chip interconnect versus flops, right? So any chip that had interconnects above a certain level and flops above a certain floating point operations above a certain level was restricted. Later, the government realized that this was a flaw in the restriction, and they cut it down to just floating point operations. And so
H800 had high flops, low communication.
Exactly. So the H800 was the same performance as H100 on flops, right? But it didn't it just had the interconnect bandwidth cut. DeepSeek knew how to utilize this. Hey, even though we're cut back on the interconnect, we can do all this fancy stuff to figure out how to use the GPU fully, anyways. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that was back in October 2022. But later in 2023, end of 2023, implemented in 2024, the US government banned the H800. Right. And so, by the way, this H800 cluster, these 2,000 GPUs, was not even purchased in 2024. Right. It was purchased in late 2023. And they're just getting the model out now, right, because it takes a lot of research, et cetera. H800 was banned. And now there's a new chip called the H20. The H20 is cut back on only flops, but the interconnect bandwidth is the same. And in fact, in some ways, it's better than the H100 because it has better memory bandwidth and memory capacity. So there are, NVIDIA is working within the constraints of what the government sets and then builds the best possible GPU for China.
Can we take this actual tangent and we'll return back to the hardware? Is the philosophy, the motivation, the case for export controls? What is it? Dario Amodei just published a blog post about export controls. The case he makes is that if AI becomes super powerful, and he says by 2026 we'll have AGI or super powerful AI, and that's going to give whoever builds that will have a significant military advantage. And so, because the United States is a democracy, and as he says, China is authoritarian or has authoritarian elements, you want a unipolar world where the super powerful military, because of the AI, is one that's a democracy. It's a much more complicated world geopolitically when you have two superpowers with super powerful AI and one is authoritarian. So that's the case he makes. And so the United States wants to use export controls to slow down, to make sure that China can't do these gigantic training runs that would be presumably required to build AGI.
This is very abstract. I think this can be the goal of how some people describe export controls, is this super powerful AI. And you touched on the training run idea. There's not many worlds where China cannot train AI models. I think export controls are kneecapping the amount of compute or the density of compute that China can have. And if you think about the AI ecosystem right now, as all of these AI companies, revenue numbers are up and to the right. Their AI usage is just continuing to grow. More GPUs are going to inference. A large part of export controls, if they work, is just that the amount of AI that can be run in China is going to be much lower. So on the training side, DeepSeek V3 is a great example, which you have a very focused team that can still get to the frontier of AI. On this 2,000 GPUs is not that hard to get, all considering in the world. They're still going to have those GPUs. They're still going to be able to train models. But if there's going to be a huge market for AI, if you have strong export controls and you want to have 100,000 GPUs just serving the equivalent of ChatGPT clusters, with good export controls, it also just makes it so that AI can be used much less. And I think that is a much easier goal to achieve than trying to debate on what AGI is. And if you have these extremely intelligent autonomous AIs and data centers, like those are the things that could be running in these GPU clusters in the United States, but not in China.
To some extent, training a model does effectively nothing, right? Like, to have a model. The thing that Dario is sort of speaking to is the implementation of that model once trained to then create huge economic growth, huge increases in military capabilities, huge increases in productivity of people, betterment of lives, whatever you want to direct super powerful AI towards, you can. But that requires significant amounts of compute. right? And so the U.S. government has effectively said, and forever, right? Like training will always be a portion of the total compute. We mentioned Meta's 400,000 GPUs, only 16,000 made Llama, right? So the percentage that Meta's dedicating to inference, now this might be for recommendation systems that are trying to hack our mind into spending more time and watching more ads, or if it's for a super powerful AI that's doing productive things, doesn't matter about the exact use that our economic system decides. It's that can be delivered in whatever way we want. Whereas with China, right, export restrictions, great. You're never going to be able to cut everything off, right? And that's like, I think that's quite well understood by the U.S. government, is that you can't cut everything off.
And they'll make their own chips. They're
they're trying to make their own chips. They'll be worse than ours, but this is the whole point, is to just keep a gap, right? Yeah. And therefore, at some point, as the AI, in a world where 2-3% economic growth, this is really dumb, by the way, right? To cut off, high tech and not make money off of it. But in a world where super powerful AI comes about and then starts creating significant changes in society, which is what all the AI leaders and big tech companies believe. I think super powerful AI is going to change society massively. And therefore, this compounding effect of the difference in compute is really important. There's some sci-fi out there where like AI is like measured in the power of how much power is delivered to compute, right? Or how much is being, that's sort of a way of thinking about what's the economic output, is just how much power you directing towards that AI.
Should we talk about reasoning models with this as a way that this might be actionable as something that people can actually see? So the reasoning models that are coming out with R1 and O1, they're designed to use more compute. There's a lot of buzzy words in the AI community about this: test time compute, inference time compute, whatever. But Dylan has good research on this. You can get to the specific numbers on the ratio of when you train a model. You can look at things about the amount of compute used at training and amount of compute used at inference. These reasoning models are making inference way more important to doing complex tasks. In the fall, in December, OpenAI announced this O3 model. There's another thing in AI: when things move fast, we get both announcements and releases. Announcements are essentially blog posts where you pat yourself on the back and you say you did things, and releases are when the model's out there, the paper's out there, etc. So OpenAI has announced O3. I mean, we can check if O3 Mini is out as of recording potentially, but that doesn't really change the point, which is that the breakthrough result was something called ARC-AGI task, which is the abstract reasoning corpus, a task for artificial general intelligence. Francois Chollet is the guy who's been, it's a multi-year-old paper. It's a brilliant benchmark. And the number for OpenAI O3 to solve this was that it used some sort of number of samples in the API. The API has like thinking effort and number of samples. They used 1,000 samples to solve this task, and it comes out to be like $5 to $20 per question, which you're putting in effectively a math puzzle, and then it takes orders of dollars to answer one question. And this is a lot of compute. If this is going to take off in the US, OpenAI needs a ton of GPUs on inference to capture this. They have this OpenAI ChatGPT Pro subscription, which is $200 a month.
Which Sam said they're losing money on.
Which means that people are burning a lot of GPUs on inference. And I've signed up with it. I've played with it. I don't think I'm a power user, but I use it. And it's like, that is the thing that a Chinese company with mediumly strong export controls, there will always be loopholes, might not be able to do it all. And if the main result for O3 is also a spectacular coding performance, and if that feeds back into AI companies being able to experiment better.
So presumably the idea is for an AGI, a much larger fraction of the compute would be used for this test time compute, for the reasoning. For the AGI goes into a room and thinks about how to take over the world, and that, come back in 2.7 hours. It's going to take a lot of compute.
This is what people like CEO or leaders of OpenAI and Anthropic talk about, is like autonomous AI models, which is you give them a task and they work on it in the background. I think my personal definition of AGI is much simpler. Like I think language models are a form of AGI, and all of this super powerful stuff is a next step that's great if we get these tools. But a language model has so much value in so many domains. It is a general intelligence to me. But this next step of agentic things where they're independent and they can do tasks that aren't in the training data is what the few-year outlook that these AI companies are driving for.
I think the terminology here that Dario uses is super powerful AI. So I agree with you on the AGI. I think we already have something like that's exceptionally impressive that Alan Turing would for sure say is AGI. But he's referring more to something once in possession of, then you would have a significant military and geopolitical advantage over other nations. So it's not just like, You can ask it how to cook an omelet.
And he has a much more positive view in his essay, Machines of Love and Grace.
Yes.
Read into this. I don't have enough background in physical sciences to gauge exactly how confident I am in if AI can revolutionize biology. I'm safe saying that AI is going to accelerate the progress of any computational science.
So we're doing a depth first search here on topics, taking tangent of a tangent. So let's continue on that depth first search. You said that you're both feeling the AGI. So what's your timeline? Dario's 2026 for the super powerful AI that's basically agentic to a degree where it's a real security threat. That level of AGI. What's your timeline?
I don't like to attribute specific abilities because predicting specific abilities and when is very hard. I think mostly if you're going to say that I'm feeling the AGI is that I expect continued rapid surprising progress over the next few years. So something like R1 is less surprising to me from DeepSeek because I expect there to be new paradigms where substantial progress can be made. I think DeepSeek R1 is so unsettling because we're kind of on this path with ChatGPT. It's like, it's getting better, it's getting better, it's getting better. And then we have a new direction for changing the models. And we took one step like this and we took a step up. So it looks like a really fast slope. And then we're going to just take more steps. So it's just really unsettling when you have these big steps. And I expect that to keep happening. I've tried OpenAI Operator. I've tried Claude computer use. They're not there yet. I understand the idea, but it's just so hard to predict what is the breakthrough that will make something like that work. And I think it's more likely that we have breakthroughs that work in things that we don't know what they're going to do. So everyone wants agents. Dario has a very eloquent way of describing this. And I just think that it's there's going to be more than that. So just expect these things to come.
I'm going to have to try to pin you down to a date on the AGI timeline. The nuclear weapon moment. So moment where on the geopolitical stage, there's a real, because we're talking about export controls. When do you think, just even to throw out a date, when do you think that would be? For me, it's probably after 2030. So I'm not as...
That's what I would say.
So define that, right? Because to me, it kind of almost has already happened, right? You look at elections in India and Pakistan, people get AI voice calls and think they're talking to the politician, right? The AI diffusion rules, which was enacted in the last couple of weeks of the Biden admin, and looks like the Trump admin will keep and potentially even strengthen, limit cloud computing and GPU sales to countries that are not even related to China. It's this is
Portugal and all these normal countries are on the you need approval from the US list.
Portugal and all these countries that are allies, right? Singapore, right? They freaking have F-35s and we don't let them buy GPUs. Mm-hmm. This to me is already to the scale of
Well, that just means that the U.S. military is really nervous about this new technology. That doesn't mean the technology is already there. So, they might be just very cautious about this thing that they don't quite understand. But that's a really good point. Sort of the robocalls, swarms of semi-intelligent bots could be a weapon. Could be doing a lot of social engineering.
I mean, there's tons of talk about, from the 2016 elections, Cambridge Analytica and all this stuff, Russian influence. I mean, every country in the world is pushing stuff onto the internet and has narratives they want, right? That's every technically competent, whether it's Russia, China, US, Israel, etc., right? People are pushing viewpoints onto the internet en masse, and language models crash the cost of very intelligent sounding language.
There's some research that shows that the distribution is actually the limiting factor. So language models haven't yet made misinformation particularly change the equation there. The internet is still ongoing. I think there's a blog, AI Snake Oil, and some of my friends at Princeton that write on this stuff. So there is research. It's a default that everyone assumes. And I would have thought the same thing, is that misinformation is going to get far worse with language models. I think in terms of internet posts and things that people have been measuring, it hasn't been a exponential increase or something extremely measurable. And things you're talking about with voice calls and stuff like that, it could be in modalities that are harder to measure. So it's something that it's too soon to tell in terms of, I think that's political instability via the web is it's monitored by a lot of researchers to see what's happening. I think that you're asking about the AGI thing. If you make me give a year, I would be okay, I have AI CEOs saying this. They've been saying 2 years for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people like Dario at Anthropic, the CEO, had thought about this so deeply. I need to take their words seriously, but also understand that they have different incentives. So I would be like, add a few years to that, which is how you get something similar to 2030 or a little after 2030.
I think to some extent we have capabilities that hit a certain point where any one person could say, oh, okay, if I can leverage those capabilities for X amount of time, this is AGI, right? Call it 27, 28. But then the cost of actually operating that capability
this is going to be my point.
so extreme that no one can actually deploy it at scale and mass to actually completely revolutionize the economy on a snap of a finger. So I don't think it will be like a snap of the finger moment.
Physical constraint.
Rather, it'll be a, the capabilities are here, but I can't deploy it everywhere, right? And so one simple example going back sort of to 2023 was when, Bing with GPT-4 came out and everyone was freaking out about search, right? Perplexity came out. If you did the cost on like, hey, implementing GPT-3 into every Google search, it was like, oh, okay, this is just like physically impossible to implement, right? And as we step forward to like going back to the test time compute thing, right? A query for, you ask ChatGPT a question, it costs cents, right? For their most capable model of chat, right? To get a query back. To solve an Arc AGI problem, though, cost $5 to $20, right? And this is
it's only going up from there.
This is 1,000, 10,000x factor difference in cost to respond to a query versus do a task. And the task of Arc AGI is not like it's simple to some extent, but it's also like, what are the tasks that we want? AGI, quote unquote, what we have today can do Arc AGI. 3 years from now, it can do much more complicated problems, but the cost is going to be measured in thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars of GPU time, and there just won't be enough power, GPUs, infrastructure to operate this and therefore shift everything in the world on the snap of the finger. But at that moment, who gets to control and point the AGI at a task? And so this was in Dario's post that he's like, hey, China can effectively and more quickly than us point their AGI at military tasks. Right. And they have been in many ways faster at adopting certain new technologies into their military, right? Especially with regards to drones, right? The US maybe has a longstanding, large air sort of, fighter jet type of thing, bombers. But when it comes to asymmetric arms, such as drones, they've completely leapfrogged the US and the West. And the fear that Dario is sort of pointing out there, I think, is that, yeah, great, we'll have AGI in the commercial sector. The US military won't be able to implement it super fast. Chinese military could, and they could direct all their resources to implementing it in the military and therefore solving, military logistics or solving some other aspect of like disinformation for targeted certain set of people so that they can flip a country's politics or something like that is actually like catastrophic versus, the US just wants to, because it'll be more capitalistically allocated just towards whatever is the highest return on income, which might be like building, factories better or whatever.
So everything I've seen, people's intuition seems to fail on robotics. So you have this kind of general optimism. I've seen this on self-driving cars. People think it's a much easier problem than it is. Similar with drones. Here, I understand it a little bit less, but I've just seen the reality of the war in Ukraine and the usage of drones on both sides. And it seems that humans still far outperform any fully autonomous systems. AI is an assistant, but humans drive. FPV drones, where the humans controlling most of it, just far, far, far outperforms AI systems. So I think it's not obvious to me that we're going to have swarms of autonomous robots anytime soon in the military context. Maybe the fastest I can imagine is 2030, which is why I said 2030 for the super powerful AI. Whenever you have large scale swarms of robots doing military actions, that's when the world just starts to look different to me. So that's the thing I'm really worried about. But there could be cyber war type of technologies that from social engineering to actually just swarms of robots that find attack vectors in our code bases and shut down power grids, that kind of stuff. And it could be one of those things like on any given weekend or something, power goes out, nobody knows why, and the world changes forever. Just power going out for 2 days in all of the United States. That will lead to murder, to chaos. But going back to export controls, do you see that as a useful way to control the balance of power geopolitically in the context of AI?
And I think going back to my viewpoint is, if you believe we're in this sort of stage of economic growth and change that we've been in for the last 20 years, the export controls are absolutely guaranteeing that China will win long term, right? If you do not believe AI is going to make significant changes to society in the next 10 years or 5 years, right? Five-year timelines are sort of what the more executives and such of AI companies and even big tech companies believe. But even 10-year timelines, it's reasonable. But once you get to, hey, these timelines are below that time period, then the only way to sort of like create a sizable advantage or disadvantage for America versus China is if you constrain compute, because talent is not really something that's constraining, right? China arguably has more talent, right? More STEM graduates, more programmers. The US can draw upon the world's people, which it does. There's tons of, foreigners in the AI industry.
So many of these AI teams are all people without a US passport.
I mean, and many of them are Chinese people who are moving to America, right? And that's great. That's exactly what we want, right? But there's that talent is one aspect, but I don't think that's one that is a measurable advantage for the US or not. It truly is just whether or not compute, right? Now, even on the compute side, when we look at chips versus data centers, right? China has the unprecedented ability to build ridiculous sums of power. Clockwork, right? They're always building more and more power. They've got steel mills that like individually are the size of the entire US industry, right? And they've got aluminum mills that consume gigawatts and gigawatts of power, right? And when we talk about what's the biggest data center, right? OpenAI made this huge thing about Stargate, their announcement there. That's like once it's fully built out in a few years, it'll be 2 gigawatts, right, of power, right? And this is still smaller than the largest, industrial facilities in China, right? China, if they wanted to build the largest data center in the world, if they had access to the chips, could. So it's just a question of when, not if, right?
So their industrial capacity far exceeds the United States?
Exactly.
To the manufacture stuff.
Yeah.
So why? So long term, they're going to be manufacturing chips there.
Chips are a little bit more specialized. I'm specifically referring to the data centers, right? Fabs take huge amounts of power. Don't get me wrong. That's not necessarily the gating factor there. The gating factor on how fast people can build the largest clusters today in the US is power, right? It is it could be power generation, power transmission, substations, and all these sorts of transformers and all these things. Building the data center, these are all constraints on the U.S. industry's ability to build larger and larger training systems, as well as deploying more and more inference compute.
I think we need to make the point clear on why the time is now for people that don't think about this, because essentially with export controls, you're making it so China cannot make or get cutting edge chips. And the idea is that if you time this wrong, China is pouring a ton of money into their chip production. And if you time it wrong, they are going to have more capacity for production, more capacity for energy, and figure out how to make the chips and have more capacity than the rest of the world to make the chips, because everybody can buy, they're going to sell their Chinese chips to everybody. They might subsidize them. And therefore, if AI takes a long time to become differentiated, we've kneecapped the financial performance of American companies. Yeah. NVIDIA can sell less. TSMC cannot sell to China. So therefore, we have less demand to keep driving the production cycle. So that's the assumption behind the timing being
less
important.
than 10 years or 5 years to above, right? China will win because of these restrictions long term, unless AI does something in the short term, which I believe AI will do, make massive changes to society in the medium short term, right? And so that's the big unlocker there. And even today, right? If Xi Jinping decided to get quote unquote scale pilled, right? I.e., decide that scaling laws are what matters, right? Just like the U.S. executives like Satya Nadella and Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar and all these U.S. executives of the biggest, most powerful tech companies have decided they're scale pilled and they're building multi-gigawatt data centers, right? Whether it's in Texas or Louisiana or Wisconsin, wherever it is, they're building these massive things that cost as much as their entire budget for spending on data centers globally in one spot, right? This is what they've committed to for next year, year after, et cetera. And so they're so convinced that this is the way, that this is what they're doing. But if China decided to, they could do it faster than us. But this is where the restrictions come in. It is not clear that China as a whole has decided, from the highest levels that this is a priority. The U.S. sort of has, right? You see Trump talking about DeepSeek and Stargate within the same week, right? So and the Biden admin as well had a lot of discussions about AI and such. It's clear that they think about it. Only just last week did DeepSeek meet the second in command of China, right? Like they have not even met the top, right? They haven't met Xi. Xi hasn't sat down and they only just released a subsidy of 1 trillion RMB, roughly $160 billion, which is closer to the spending of like Microsoft and Meta and Google combined, right, for this year. So it's like they're realizing it just now. But that's where the export restrictions come in and say, hey, you can't ship the most powerful U.S. chips to China. You can ship a cut down version. You can't ship the most powerful chips to all these countries who we know are just going to rent it to China. You have to limit the numbers, right?
And the tools.
So and same with manufacturing equipment,
GPU.
Tools, all these different aspects. But it all stems from AI, and then what downstream can slow them down in AI. And so the entire semiconductor restrictions, you read them, they are very clear. It's about AI and military civil fusion of technology, right? It's very clear. And then from there it goes, oh, well, we're banning them from buying like lithography tools and etch tools and deposition tools. And, oh, this random subsystem from a random company that's like tiny, right? Like, why are we banning this? Because all of it, the US government has decided is critical to AI systems.
I think the fulcrum point is like the transition from 7 nanometer to 5 nanometer chips, where I think it was Huawei that had the 7 nanometer chip a few years ago, which caused another political brouhaha, almost like this moment. And then it's the ASML deep EUV, what is that?
Extreme ultraviolet lithography. To set context on the chips, right, what Nathan's referring to is in 2020, Huawei released their Ascend 910 chip, which was an AI chip, first one on 7 nanometer, before Google did, before NVIDIA did. And they submitted it to the MLPerf benchmark, which is sort of a industry standard for machine learning performance benchmark. And it did quite well. And it was the best chip at the submission, right? This was a huge deal. The Trump admin, of course, banned it was 2019, right? Banned the Huawei from getting 7 nanometer chips from TSMC. And so then they had to switch to move using internal domestically produced chips, which was a multi-year setback.
Many companies have done 7 nanometer chips. And the question is like, we don't know how much Huawei was subsidizing production of that chip. Like Intel has made 7 nanometer chips that are not profitable and things like this. So this is how it all feeds back into the economic engine of export controls.
Well, so you're saying that for now, Xi Jinping has not felt the AGI, but it feels like the DeepSeek moment might, like, there might be meetings going on now where he's going to start wearing the same T-shirt and things are going to escalate.
I mean, this, he may have woken up last week, right? Lian Feng met the the second command guy, and they had a meeting. And then the next day, they announced the AI subsidies, which are 1 trillion RMB, right?
So it's possible that this DeepSeek moment is truly the beginning of a Cold War.
That's what a lot of people are worried about. People in AI have been worried that this is going towards a Cold War, or already is.
But it's not DeepSeek's fault, but there's something, a bunch of factors came together where it was like this explosion. I mean, it all has to do with NVIDIA stock going down, probably. But it's just some mass hysteria that happened that eventually led to Xi Jinping having meetings and waking up to this idea.
And the U.S. government realized in October 7th, 2022, before ChatGPT released, that restriction on October 7th, which dropped and shocked everyone, and it was very clearly aimed at AI. Everyone was like, what the heck are you doing?
Stable Diffusion was out then, but not ChatGPT.
Yeah, but not ChatGPT.
So it was like starting to be rumblings like
of what Gen AI can do to society, but it was very clear, I think, to at least like National Security Council and those sort of folks that this was where the world is headed, this Cold War that's happening.
So is there any concerns that the export controls push China to take military action on Taiwan?
This is the big risk, right? The further you push China away from having access to cutting edge American and global technologies, the more likely they are to say, well, because I can't access it, I might as well like no one should access it, right? And there's a few like interesting aspects of that, right? Like, China has a urban rural divide like no other. They have a male female birth ratio like no other, to the point where, if you look in most of China, it's like the ratio is not that bad, but when you look at single dudes in rural China, it's like a 30-to-1 ratio. And those are disenfranchised dudes, right? Like, quote unquote, like the US has an incel problem, like China does too. It's just they're placated in some way or crushed down. What do you do with these people? And at the same time, you're not allowed to access the most important technology. At least the US thinks so. China's maybe starting to think this is the most important technology by starting to dump subsidies in it, right? They thought EVs and renewables were the most important technology. They dominate that now, right? Now they started thinking about semiconductors in, the late 2010s and early 2020s. And now they've been dumping money and they're catching up rapidly. And they're going to do the same with AI, right? Because they're very talented, right? So the question is like, when does this hit a breaking point, right? And if China sees this as, hey, they can continue, if not having access and starting a true hot war, right, taking over Taiwan or trying to subvert its democracy in some way or blockading it, hurts the rest of the world far more than it hurts them, this is something they could potentially do, right? And so is this pushing them towards that? Potentially, right? I'm not quite a geopolitical person, but it's obvious that the world regime of peace and like trade is like super awesome for economics, but at some point it could break, right?
I think we should comment that why Chinese economy would be hurt by that is that they're export heavy. I think the United States buys so much, like if that goes away, like that's how their economy.
Well, also they just like would not be able to import raw materials from like all over the world, right? The US would just shut down the Strait of Malacca, and like, at the same time, the US you could argue almost all the GDP growth in America since, the 70s has been either population growth or tech, right? Because, your life today is not that much better than someone from the 80s outside of tech, right? You still, cars, they all have semiconductors in them everywhere. Fridges, semiconductors everywhere. There's these funny stories about how Russians were taking apart laundry machines because they had certain like Texas Instrument chips that they could then repurpose and put into like their anti-missile things, right? Like their S-400 or whatever. You would know more about this, but there's all sorts of like everything about semiconductors is so integral to every part of our lives.
So can you explain the role of TSMC in the story of semiconductors, and maybe also how the United States can break the reliance on TSMC?
I don't think it's necessarily breaking the reliance. I think it's getting TSMC to build in the U.S. But taking a step back, right? TSMC produces most of the world's chips, right? Especially on the foundry side. There's a lot of companies that build their own chips. Samsung, Intel, ST Micro, Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, all these kinds of companies build their own chips, NXP, but more and more of these companies are outsourcing to TSMC and have been for multiple decades.
Can you explain the supply chain there and where most of TSMC is in terms of manufacturing?
Sure. So historically, supply chain was companies would build their own chips. They would, it'd be a company started, they'd build their own chips, and then they'd design the chip and build the chip and sell it. Over time, this became really difficult because the cost of building a fab continues to compound every single generation. Of course, figuring out the technology for it is incredibly difficult regardless, but just the dollars and cents that are required, ignoring, saying, hey, yes, I have all the technical capability, which it's really hard to get that, by the way, right? Intel's failing, Samsung's failing, et cetera. But if you look at just the dollars to spend to build that next generation fab, it keeps growing, right? Sort of like, Moore's law is having the cost of chips every 2 years. There's a separate law that's sort of like doubling the cost of fabs every handful of years. And so you look at a leading edge fab that is going to be profitable today, that's building, 3 nanometer chips or 2 nanometer chips in the future. That's going to cost north of $30-40 billion, right? And that's just for like a token amount. That's for that's like the base building block. And you probably need to build multiple, right? And so when you look at the industry, over the last, if I go back 20-30 years ago, there were 20-30 companies that could build the most advanced chips, and then they would design them themselves and sell them, right? So companies like AMD would build their own chips. Intel, of course, still builds their own chips. They're very famous for it. But IBM would build their own chips. And, you could just keep going down the list. All these companies built their own chips. Slowly, they kept falling like flies. And that's because of what TSMC did, right? They created the foundry business model, which is, I'm not going to design any chips. I'm just going to contract manufacture chips for other people. And one of their early customers is NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA is the only semiconductor company that's worth, that's doing more than $1 billion of revenue that was started in the era of foundry, right? Every other company started before then and at some point had fabs, which is actually incredible, right? Like AMD and Intel and Broadcom.
Such a
through
great
the history.
fact.
It's like everyone had fabs at some point, or some companies like Broadcom, it was like a merger, amalgamation of various companies that rolled up. But even today, Broadcom has fabs, right? They build iPhone RF radio chips sort of in Colorado for Apple, right? Like there's all these companies had fabs, and for most of the fabs, they threw them away or sold them off, or they got rolled into something else. And now everyone relies on TSMC, right? Including Intel. Their latest PC chip uses TSMC chips, right? It also uses some Intel chips, but it uses TSMC process.
Can you explain why the foundry model is so successful for these companies? Why are they going with
economies of scale?
Yeah, so I mean, like I mentioned, right? The cost of building a fab is so high. The R&D is so difficult. And when you look at like these companies that had their own vertical stack, there was an antiquated process of like, okay, like I'm so hyper customized to each specific chip, right? But as we've gone through the history of sort of like the last 50 years of electronics and semiconductors, you need more and more specialization, right? Because Moore's law has died. Dennard scaling has died, i.e. chips are not getting better just for free, right? From manufacturing, you have to make real architectural innovations, right? Google is not just running on Intel CPUs for web serving. They have a YouTube chip, they have TPUs, they have Pixel chips, they have a wide diversity of chips that, generate all the economic value of Google, right? It's running all the services and stuff. And this is just Google, and you could go across any company in the industry, and it's like this, right? Cars contain 5,000 chips, 200 different varieties of them, right? All these random things. A Tesla door handle has 2 chips, right? Like it's like ridiculous. And it's a cool door handle, right? It's like, you don't think about it, but it's like has 2 really chipped like penny like chips in there, right? Anyway, so as you have more diversity of chips, as you have more specialization required, and the cost of fabs continues to grow, you need someone who is laser focused on building the best process technology and making it as flexible as possible.
I think you could say it simply, which is the cost per fab goes up. And if you are a small player that makes a few types of chips, you're not going to have the demand to pay back the cost of the fab. Whereas NVIDIA can have many different customers and aggregate all this demand into one place. And then they're the only person that makes enough money building chips to build the next fab. So this is kind of why the companies slowly get killed, because they have 10 years ago a chip that is profitable and is good enough, but the cost to build the next one goes up. They may try to do this, fail because they don't have the money to make it work, and then they don't have any chips, or they build it and it's too expensive and they just have
or they
not
run
profitable
it, there's
chips.
more failure points, right? You could have one little process related to like some sort of like chemical etch, or some sort of like plasma etch, or some little process that screws up. You didn't engineer it right, and now the whole company falls apart. You can't make chips, right? And so super, super powerful companies like Intel, they had like the weathering storm to like, hey, they still exist today, even though they really screwed up their manufacturing 6-7 years ago. But in the case of like AMD, they almost went bankrupt. They had to sell their fabs to Mubadala, UAE, right? And like that became a separate company called Global Foundries, which is a foundry firm. And then AMD was able to then focus on the return back up, was like, hey, let's focus on making chiplets and a bunch of different chips for different markets, and focusing on specific workloads rather than all of these different things. And so you get more diversity of chips. You have more companies than ever designing chips, but you have fewer companies than ever manufacturing them, right? And this is where TSMC comes in, is they've just been the best, right? They are so good at it, right? They're customer focused. They make it easy for you to fabricate your chips. They take all of that complexity and like kind of try and abstract a lot of it away from you. They make good money. They don't make insane money, but they make good money. And they're able to aggregate all this demand and continue to build the next fab, the next fab, the next fab.
So why is Taiwan so special for TSMC? Why is it happening there? Can it be replicated inside the United States?
Yeah, so there's aspects of it that I would say yes, and aspects that I'd say no, right? TSMC is way ahead because former executive Morris Chang of Texas Instruments wasn't promoted to CEO, and he's like, screw this, I'm going to go make my own chip company, right? And he went to Taiwan and made TSMC, right? And there's a whole lot more story there. So it could have been Texas Instruments, could have been could have been TSMC, but Texas semiconductor manufacturing, right? Instead of, Texas Instruments, right? But so there is that whole story there. But the
sitting here in Texas.
I mean, and that sounds like a human story. Like, he didn't get promoted.
Just the brilliance of Morris Chang, which I wouldn't underplay, but there's also like a different level of like how this works, right? So in Taiwan, the top percent of graduates, of students that go to the best school, which is NTU, the top percent of those all go work to TSMC, right? And guess what their pay is? Their starting pay is like $80,000, $70,000, right? Which is like, that's like starting pay for like a good graduate in the US, right? Not the top. The top graduates are making hundreds of thousands of dollars at the Googles and the Amazons, and now I guess the OpenAIs of the world, right? So there is a large dichotomy of like, what is the top 1% of the society doing, and where are they headed because of economic reasons, right? Intel never paid that crazy good, right? And it didn't make sense to them, right? That's one aspect, right? Where is the best going? Second is the work ethic, right? Like, we like to work, you work a lot, we work a lot, but at the end of the day, when there's what is the time and amount of work that you're doing, and what does a fab require, right? Fabs are not work from home jobs. You go into the fab and grueling work, right? There's hey, if there is any amount of vibration, right? An earthquake happens, vibrates the machines. They're all, they're either broken, you've scrapped some of your production, and then in many cases they're like not calibrated properly. So when there's an earthquake, right? Recently there's been an earthquake. TSMC doesn't call their employees. They just go to the fab, and like they just show up, the parking lot gets slammed, and people just go into the fab and fix it, right? Like it's like it's like ants, right? Like it's like, a hive of ants doesn't get told by the queen what to do. The ants just know.
It's like one person just specializes on these one task. And it's like, you're going to take this one tool and you're the best person in the world. And this is what you're going to do for your whole life, is this one task in the fab.
Which is like some special chemistry plus nano manufacturing on one line of tools that continues to get iterated. And yeah, it's like specific plasma etch for removing silicon dioxide, right? That's all you focus on your whole career. And it's like such a specialized thing. And so it's not like the tasks are transferable. AI today is awesome because like people can pick it up like that. Semiconductor manufacturing is very antiquated and difficult. None of the materials are online for people to read easily and learn, right? The papers are very dense, and like it takes a lot of experience to learn. And so it makes the barrier to entry much higher too. So when you talk about, hey, you have all these people that are super specialized, they will work, 80 hours a week in a factory, right? In a fab. And if anything goes wrong, they'll go show up in the middle of the night because some earthquake. Their wife's like, there was an earthquake. He's like, great, I'm gonna go to the fab. It's
time to grind.
Would you like, as an American, do that, right? It's like these sorts of things are like what, I guess are the exemplifying like why TSMC is so amazing. Now, can you replicate it in the US? Let's not ignore Intel was the leader in manufacturing for over 20 years. They brought every technology to market first, besides EUV, strained silicon, high-K metal gates, FinFET, and the list just goes on and on and on of technologies that Intel brought to market first, made the most money from, and manufactured at scale first, best, highest profit margins, right? So we shouldn't ignore that Intel can't do this, right? It's that the culture has broken, right? You've invested in the wrong things. They said no to the iPhone. They had all these different things regarding like, mismanagement of the fabs, mismanagement of designs, this lockup, right? And at the same time, all these brilliant people, right? These like 50,000 PhDs, or masters that have been working on specific chemical or physical processes or nano manufacturing processes for decades in Oregon. They're still there. They're still producing amazing work. It's just like getting it to the last mile of production at high yield, where you can where you can manufacture dozens and hundreds of different kinds of chips. And it's good customer experience has broken, right? It's that customer experience. It's like part of it is like people will say Intel was too pompous in the 2010s, right? They just thought they were better than everyone. The tool guys were like, oh, I don't think that this is mature enough. And they're like, you just don't know. We know, right? This sort of stuff would happen. And so can the US bring it to the, can the U.S. bring leading-edge semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S.? Emphatically, yes, right? And we are, right?
It's happening. Arizona is getting better and better as time goes on.
TSMC has built, roughly 20% of their capacity for 5 nanometer in the US, right? Now, this is nowhere near enough, right? 20% of capacity in the US is like nothing, right? And furthermore, this is still dependent on Taiwan existing, right? There's sort of important way to separate it out. There's R&D and there's high volume manufacturing. There there are three places in the world that are doing leading edge R&D. There's Hsinchu, Taiwan, there's Hillsboro, Oregon, and there is Pyongyang, South Korea, right? These three places are doing the leading edge R&D for the rest of the world's leading edge semiconductors, right? Now, manufacturing can be distributed more globally, right? And this is sort of where this dichotomy exists of like, who's actually modifying the process, who's actually developing the next generation one, who's improving them, is Hsinchu, is Hillsboro, is Pyongyang, right? It is not the rest of these, fabs like Arizona, right? Arizona is a paperweight. If Hsinchu disappeared off the face of the planet, within a year, couple years, Arizona would stop producing too, right? It's actually like pretty critical. One of the things I like to say is if I had like a few missiles, I know exactly where I could cause the most economic damage, right? It's not targeting the White House, right?
It's the R&D centers.
It's the R&D centers for TSMC, Intel, Samsung, and then some of the memory guys, Micron and Hynix.
Because they define the future evolution of these semiconductors, and everything's moving so rapidly that it really is fundamentally about R&D. And it is all about TSMC.
And so TSMC, you cannot purchase a vehicle without TSMC chips, right? You cannot purchase a fridge without TSMC chips. You cannot, I think one of the few things you can purchase, ironically, is a Texas Instruments like graphing calculator, right? Because they actually manufacture in Texas. But like outside of that, like a laptop, a phone, anything servers, right? GPUs, none of this stuff can exist. And this is without TSMC. And in many cases, it's not even like the leading edge, sexy 5 nanometer chip, 3 nanometer chip, 2 nanometer chip. Oftentimes it's just like some stupid power IC that's like converting from like, some voltage to another, right? And it's made at TSMC, right?
This
is
like what China is investing in as well. It's like they can build out this long tail fab where the techniques are much more known. You don't have to figure out these problems with EUV. They're investing in this, and then they have large supply for things like the car door handles and the random stuff. And that trickles down into this whole economic discussion as well, which is they have far more than we do. And having supply for things like this is crucial to normal life.
So they're starting to invest in high volume manufacture, but they're not doing R&D.
So they do R&D on their own. They're just way behind, right? Yeah. So I would say like in 2015, China had a 5-year plan where they defined by 2025 and 2020 certain goals, including like 80% domestic production of semiconductors. They're not going to hit that, right? To be clear, but they are in certain areas really, really close, right? Like BYD is probably going to be the first company in the world to not have to use TSMC for making, because they have their own fabs, right? For making chips. Now they still have to buy some chips from foreign, for example, like around like self-driving ADAS capabilities, because those are really high end. But at least like like an internal combustion engine has 40 chips in an EV, just for like controlling like flow rates and all these things. And EVs are even more complicated. So all these different power ICs and battery management controllers and all these things, they're insourcing, right? And this is something that like China has been doing since 2015. Now, as far as like the trailing edge, they're getting so much capacity there. As far as the leading edge, right, i.e. this 5 nanometer and so on and so forth, right, where GPUs, they are still behind. And this is the US restrictions are trying to stop them in the latter. But, all that's happened, is yes, they've slowed down their 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, et cetera, but they've accelerated their, 45 nanometer, 90 nanometer power IC or analog IC or, random chip in my keyboard, right? That kind of stuff. So there is an angle of like the US's actions have been so from these export, from the angle of the export controls have been so inflammatory at slowing down China's progress on the leading edge that they've turned around and have accelerated their progress elsewhere because they know this is so important, right? If the US is going to lock them out here, what if they lock us out here as well in the trailing edge? And so going back, can the US build it here? Yes, but it's going to take a ton of money. I truly think like to revolutionize and completely insource semiconductors would take a decade and $1 trillion.
Is some of it also culture? Like you said, extreme competence, extreme work ethic in Taiwan.
I think if you have the demand and the money is on the line, the American companies figure it out. It's going to take hand-holding with the government, but I think that the culture helps TSMC break through, and it's easier for them.
TSMC has some like 90,000 employees, right? It's not actually that insane an amount. The Arizona fab has 3,000 from Taiwan. And these people, like their wives were like, yeah, we're not going to have kids unless you sign up for the Arizona fab. We go to Arizona and we have our kids there. There's also a Japan fab where the same thing happened, right? And so like these wives drove like these dudes to like go to Japan or America to have the kids there. And it's like it's an element of culture. Yeah, sure. Taiwan works that hard, but also like the US has done it in the past. They could do it now, right? We can just import the best people in the world if we want to.
That's where the immigration conversation is a tricky one, and there's been a lot of debate over that. But yeah, it seems absurdly controversial to import the best people in the world. I don't understand why it's controversial. That's one of the ways of winning.
Sure, we agree with you.
And like even if you can't import those people, I still think you could do a lot to manufacture most of it in the U.S. if the money's there, right? Yeah. And so
it's just way more expensive. It's not profitable for a long time.
And that's the context of like the CHIPS Act is only like $50 billion relative to some of the renewable initiatives that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, which total in the hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And so like the amount of money that the US is spending on the semiconductor industry is nothing, right? Whereas all these other countries have structural advantages in terms of like, work ethic and amount of work and like things like that, but also a number of STEM graduates, the percentile of their best going to that, right? But they also have like differences in terms of like, hey, there's just tax benefits in the law and have been in the law for 20 years, right? And then some countries have massive subsidies, right? China has something like $200 billion of semiconductor subsidies a year. We're talking about $50 billion in the US over like 6, right? So the girth or difference in like the subsidy amounts is also huge, right? And so I think Trump has been talking about tariffing Taiwan recently. That's sort of like one of these things that's like, oh, okay, well, like, maybe he doesn't want to subsidize the US semiconductor industry. Obviously, tariffing Taiwan is going to cost a lot of things to go get much more expensive, but does it change the equation for TSMC building more fabs in the US? That's what he's sort of positing, right?
So can you lay out we laid out the importance. By the way, it's incredible how much you know about so much.
We told you Dylan knows all the stuff.
Yeah. So, okay, you laid out why TSMC is really important. If we look out into the future, 10, 20 years out, US-China relationship seems like it can go to a dark place of Cold War, escalated Cold War, or even hot war, or to a good place of anything from frenemies to cooperation to working together. So in this game theory, complicated game, what are the different trajectories? What should U.S. be doing? Like, what do you see as the different possible trajectories of U.S.-China relations as both leaders start to feel the AGI more and more and see the importance of chips and the importance of AI?
I mean, ultimately, the export controls are pointing towards a separate future economy. I think the U.S. has made it clear to Chinese leaders that we intend to control this technology at whatever cost to global economic integration.
So
that it's hard to unwind that. Like the card has been played.
To the same extent, they've also limited U.S. companies from entering China, right? So it is it's been a long time coming. At some point, there was a convergence, right? But over at least the last decade, it's been branching further and further out, right? Like U.S. companies can't enter China, Chinese companies can't enter the U.S. The U.S. is saying, hey, China, you can't get access to our technologies in certain areas. And China's rebuttaling with the same thing around they've done some sort of specific materials in, gallium and things like that they've tried to limit the US on. There's a US drone company that's not allowed to buy batteries, and they have military customers. And this drone company just tells the military customers hey, just get it from Amazon because I can't actually physically get them, right? There's all these things that are happening that point to further and further divergence. I have zero idea, and I would love if we could all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but I have zero idea how that could possibly happen.
Is the divergence good or bad for avoiding war? Is it possible that the divergence in terms of manufacture of chips, of training AI systems, is actually good for avoiding military
It's an
conflict.
objective fact that the world has been the most peaceful it has ever been when there are global hegemons, right? Or regional hegemons, right? In historical context, right? The Mediterranean was the most peaceful ever when the Romans were there, right? China had very peaceful and warring times, and the peaceful times were when dynasties had a lockhold over not just themselves, but all their tributaries around them, right? And likewise, the most peaceful time in human history has been when the U.S. was the global hegemon, right? The last decades. Now we've sort of seen things start to slide, right? With Russia, Ukraine, with what's going on in the Middle East, and Taiwan risk. All these different things are starting to bubble up. Still, objectively, extremely peaceful. Now, what happens when it's not one global hegemon, but it's two? Obviously, and China will be competitive or even overtake the U.S. like it's possible, right? And so this change in global hegemony. It's I don't think it ever happens like super peacefully, right? When empires fall, right, which is a possible trajectory for America, they don't fall gracefully, right? Like they don't just slide out of irrelevance. Usually there's a lot of shaking. And so, what the US is trying to do is maintain its top position, and what China is trying to do is become the top position, right? And obviously there's butting of heads here. In the most simple terms.